Hi everyone, this is Sarah Michel, and with another weekly challenge to God. This is my 8th week doing this challenge. For those who have never seen any of the other challenges, I'm going to be talking about a theme related to the God claim for the next few minutes, and we'll wait and see if God is going to show up during this time. In fact, I demand him to show up if he wants me to believe in him, because I don't. I am an atheist. But I can give you a spoiler that nothing is going to happen because God is not real. And until God himself or anyone else provides any evidence that he exists, I will keep holding my position that he doesn't. Now, today, what I want to talk about is exactly that, evidence, and the methodology used to determine evidence, to determine what is true and what is false. So one thing I often see when you have a believer and a non-believer in God discussing these topics is they often argue about the concept of truth, but very rarely I see people discussing about the methodology to assess truth. Last week, I talked about extraordinary claims and how we often have different standards for claims. People often have different standards for extraordinary claims, and supernatural claims tend to have people tend to be much more open to assuming the possibility of spiritual and supernatural claims rather than other claims that are not so much invested on. We have a personal investment on supernatural claims. And the reason, I think, is because we are afraid of death. We are afraid that death is final, and we crave for the existence of something after we die. And that's why I think we are usually more open to the possibility of extraordinary claims that are made regarding the supernatural. Now, what I argue about that is that people tend to be more open to these claims not because of not for reasons, not for good reasons, but simply out of fear, not out of reason. People are more open to supernatural claims because they are scared of death. They are scared of never seeing the people that they loved again. And that is understandable, but that is not reasonable. And this goes into an epistemological debate, which is what is the most reasonable way to approach knowledge, to approach truth, to determine what is true and what is false. And what religious people, and this is both for Western and Eastern religions, they tend to have an idealistic approach when it comes to supernatural claims, when it comes to religious claims, to theistic and deist claims. One thing that I often hear from apologists and people who defend the position that there is a God is that in order to reject God, you need to know God. So everybody knows there is a God, therefore God exists. But when you're talking about rejecting God, is rejecting the concept of a God. The concept of a God, I don't think anyone is crazy enough to reject, to say that the concept of God doesn't exist. It certainly does. The same way that the concept of unicorns, of Pegasus, of Zeus, of the flying spaghetti monster, all of these concepts exist. The concept of werewolves exists. The concept is real. The idea of a werewolf is something that we all have in our minds. When we hear the word werewolf, we all have a concept of what a werewolf is. But that doesn't prove that werewolves exist in the natural world. That werewolves, a material werewolf made out of matter, of atoms, exist. And that is the whole standard for truth that we are talking about when we say God isn't real. We are not talking about concept of God. We are not talking about the idea of God. We are talking about an actual physical being, or at least a being that is capable of manipulating matter. This being hasn't been proved yet to exist. A being that is all-knowing and all-powerful and that manipulates matter at his own will hasn't been proven. That can do anything, that can change the laws of physics, the laws of chemistry in order to provide miracles. Hasn't been proven that this being exists. And this is what we're talking about. We're not talking about concepts. Now, my position when it comes to idealism and Western philosophy and Western religion, especially Christianity, borrows a lot from Platonic idealism. And it's the idea that concepts exist outside of matter, as if they exist on themselves. I don't completely reject this metaphysical idea of concepts. I think concepts, it's something that certainly requires a little bit more of my consideration, because I understand that there is truth in archetypes, there is truth in concepts, but they're only truth because they make sense in the actual physical world. I hear a story that I know it's a fairy tale, all right? I hear any fucking story, Cinderella or Snow White. There is truth in that story. I can learn things from it. But the things I learn, I recognize that they are true because they match with what I observe in the actual physical world. So I assess the truth of a story, the truth of an archetype, if we're talking now about archetypes and psychology, based on how much it reflects what I observe in the physical world. So ultimately, these things are real and exist, and I'm talking here about concepts, because there is, let's call, a physical substrate in which they can exist. In the case of ideas and concepts, we need a brain for those things to emerge. If there are no brains, there are no ideas, there are no concepts. So even though these concepts do survive generation after generation, for them to emerge and to be promulgated and to propagate, there is the necessity of a physical substrate for them to propagate. So ultimately, I do think I reject metaphysics. I certainly reject Platonic idealism because I see no reason how concepts and ideas would still survive after we die. Let's say if tomorrow all of human race disappears and all of our knowledge disappears, if all of our books and computers, everything is gone, all our concepts would die with us. They wouldn't survive. They need this physical means in order to exist. So in this sense, I definitely reject Platonic idealism. But metaphysicality or some ideas of metaphysics, that there is something not something beyond like there is something beyond the physical, the physical world. There is something beyond matter, which are ideas and concepts, or our minds. I do understand that it does feel like it, and I do understand that there is still a lot of the human brain that we don't understand, that we don't know, and our ideas certainly influence the neural substrates of our brains. What we think, how we think, certainly is able to shape and even reshape our brains. But ultimately, you still need brains, and you still need books, you still need computers in order to grasp ideas, to acquire and get to know them, and get to propagate them. So I think ultimately I do reject metaphysics, but I'm going here on a tangent. The whole point is, when you're talking about empirical when we atheists and skeptics are talking about empirical evidence, we're talking about evidence for God. We're talking about empirical evidence. We are talking about something that can be verified and measured through an experiment. This is what we're talking about. We're not talking about concept and idea. Of course we know the concept of God, obviously, but that doesn't tell anything about the existence of a physical entity or a spiritual entity, whatever, that is capable of manipulating matter. Because even if you believe God is spiritual, somehow God is capable of manipulating matter. And you have to prove with empirical evidence, testable evidence, that this God exists, and hasn't been proven. This entity that we would call God has never been proven to exist. And I think when debating someone who is religious, and you're debating about evidence, and you're debating about atheism, that is always the best place to start. When you're talking about truth, when you're talking about evidence, what method are we going to use to determine truth? What method are you going to use about determining evidence? What do you mean by God? Do you mean by a physical entity, or do you mean, if you're talking about a spiritual entity, is a spiritual entity capable of manipulating matter? Did God put the idea of his existence in our brains? Because if you say put it in our soul, you have to prove then we have a soul. And that is something that no one has proven yet. So we're going to the same thing. Before you make a claim that God exists and can manipulate matter, you have to demonstrate that such being has manipulated matter once. And this, I will repeat, hasn't been proven. And I'm giving this being the opportunity to do it every week when I do these streams. And so far nothing happened. And I will keep insisting nothing will happen. Because as I said earlier, the God that most of these people who are religious people defend is an impossibility. This God cannot exist. It doesn't make any sense unless pretty much everything that we know about reality is wrong. And if that is true, and everything we know about reality is wrong, then I would also argue that God has been lying to us all this time, and he has somehow manipulating reality, or manipulating us and tricking us to believe in things that aren't real. But that is another topic for another week. So, as I said, nothing happened. I'm still here. God hasn't proven to be real. God hasn't showed up. God hasn't punished me for my heresy and for my blasphemies, my constant blasphemies. So nothing happened. Nothing will happen. God isn't real. I am Sarah Michel. Thank you for watching, and I will definitely see you again next week. Cheers.